bug hunters, web application testers, you all need to be testing for this one vulnerability: prototype pollution. Now you're probably asking, what is prototype pollution? Have a seat. I'm here to tell you everything you need to know about prototype pollution and set you off to go find those bugs yourself. It is a devastating attack, and it is good to look for whenever you're doing any kind of web application testing. But before we jump into the technicality of things, I need to tell you a story. So have a seat. Let's say you live in a gated community. We'll say a really suburban, maybe rich gated community, the one that we all want to live in. And let's say this community shares a single water supply. We'll say from a water reservoir, and it's really clean, so people can drink the water, you can cook with it, you can bathe in the water. There's no contamination whatsoever. It's a beautiful life. Now let's say one criminal decides to pour oil into the water and contaminate the water, enough oil to fully contaminate the reservoir. Now this water will go into each of the houses in this community, and you can't drink it anymore. It is now contaminated, or it's polluted. You see, what I just described is a physical form of pollution. A criminal goes and pollutes the water, thus affecting all of the houses in this community and all the people around the community. In the same way, prototype pollution affects JavaScript objects, and we'll learn about what objects are in JavaScript, but it affects those objects, thus affecting many things tied to that object, which could deface an entire website, bring an application down, cause other vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting, remote code execution, and abundance more things. It's a really neat bug. It can be a little complex. There are many ways to look for prototype pollution, but just know it's about looking for objects in JavaScript that utilizes prototypes, which are common objects, and being able to manipulate those prototype based objects in order to achieve a desirable result for a malicious hacker. But if you're not malicious, well, you're looking for those things so you can report it, because we're not malicious here. We're ethical. So let's keep things ethical. Okay, before I show you prototype pollution, we need to talk about JavaScript objects so you can know what that is. But before we dive into that, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, comment on the video, like the video. Your participation in doing that, subscribing, commenting, liking, that's going to help me to dish out more training content, especially for you bug hunters and web application testers out there. So go ahead and do that. All right, let's take a look at JavaScript objects. So when we talk about objects in JavaScript, objects are just containers for values in JavaScript. What I mean by that is you can think of an object almost like a variable, but instead of storing one value, so like x equals 1, an object can store many values. So it's almost like this container that can store a bunch of things about whatever that object is. Let me show you a real world example of how that would look, and then we'll look at a little bit of JavaScript, just snippets of it, so you can see what an object looks like. So in this case, we have 3 boxes, right? We have your computer object, which is the actual object, which is just going to be your computer. And then you have object properties. So that is going to be details about the computer. And then lastly, you have your methods, which are, we'll say, instructions that can be used from the object properties that rely based on the object that you have selected. So in this case, we'll say the computer object, right? And so the computer object properties, we'll say the brand is Lenovo. It was not sponsored by Lenovo, but for the sake of this video, the brand is Lenovo. The computer model is ThinkPad, the T14, one of those good old ThinkPad computers, the laptops. The computer color, we'll say in this case, is black, and the computer weight, 1.5 kg or 3.3 pounds. Okay, now we start moving on to the methods. So with this computer, you have your power on method, your power off method, your connect to Wi-Fi method, and your disconnect from Wi-Fi method. So there's a lot more methods you can add for this computer object, but you can see how it works. The object properties are called directly from the computer object, so computer.brand, computer.model, things like that. The methods are the actual actions, we'll say, that the object can do, so computer.poweron, computer.poweroff, things like that. In JavaScript, the computer object is also considered like a prototype, and that's where the word prototype and prototype pollution comes from. There are 2 ways to add methods for objects. One is the legacy way, we'll say. The other way is ES6, which is a newer way to add methods to the object that we're talking about. So let's take a look at how that looks in JavaScript. Okay, so these are snippets in JavaScript. In this case, instead of the computer, we decided to create an object called car. And so the car has a make, model, year, color, and the speed of the car. In this case, we'll say the speed is 0, just for the sake of this video. So as you can see from the legacy approach, which is on the left here, once you create your object and you assign a method to those objects, the method being like the description about those objects, right? Or the things that that object can do. Once you define those methods, you see in the legacy approach, you have the word prototype. And this is what I mean by prototype is technically an object, and the legacy approach is more clear. So car, which is the object, dot prototype dot accelerate. And you have car dot prototype dot break and car dot prototype dot get info. Now, if we look at the right in the more modern approach, we can see we actually don't even need to include the word prototype. So you have accelerate, break, and get info. So the word prototype isn't included, although the ES6 approach, which is the modern approach, does use prototypes. It just doesn't have to be included. So this is important because when we're looking for prototype pollution, we are actually not just looking for the word prototype, although that would be helpful. And there are times where web applications still use the word prototype so you can test. But we can assume that a lot of these methods are being called from a prototype and test these methods as if they were. Worst case, they don't work, we continue moving on to another method. But it's always good to test and see if 1, these methods are created from prototypes, and 2, the prototypes are not secured, meaning that we can change a value, add a value, change some of the constructor, we'll say, or do something to manipulate the website beyond the client-sided end. So now that we understand objects in JavaScript, I want to show you 2 labs, both on PortSwigger, so you can test these labs out yourself. But we're going to look at 2 labs on client-side prototype pollution and also server-side prototype pollution, and how to exploit both of them, where to look. I'm going to show you my thought process, and then I'll show you like an easier way to do things. So when you're out there doing your bug tests, feel free to look at these things, these JavaScript files, and try to find prototype pollution out there. It's in more applications than you think. And let me just show you how prototype pollution works. Okay, so in this case, I have Burp Suite open, as you can see. We're actually going to use the Burp browser because the Burp browser has a really cool extension that we'll get to see later. But before we do that, we'll do things a manual way just so you can see. So if you go to proxy, intercept, you have your Burp browser here. You want to open Burp browser. There you go. I want to go to PortSwigger Labs. So bear with me as I grab the PortSwigger Labs. Here we are. So this is the PortSwigger lab. What we're going to do is just go ahead and access this. Log in. Here we are. Basic lab. And for this, we want to test for client-side prototype pollution, of course, as the header said. So what we're going to do is we want to open DevTools, and I want to go to the console. So we want to go to the console here because for client side, if you're going to exploit prototype pollution, you probably want to look for something like cross-site scripting, where you can share a URL with your victim, and that victim will click on the URL, and then the cross-site scripting prototype based exploit will fire. So more of like a chain thing. So if we want to send a URL to a client, then we have to see if there's any kind of parameter in the URL that would allow us to do so. So we can start and do a basic prototype object assignment and see if we can do anything with this. So we'll say proto, which is like in JavaScript, this is used for prototype, right? And so we can do proto and we'll say tests, for example, test equals test1 and no spaces, just like that. And we'll see what happens. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this period out. There we go, just like that. Okay, and so we see test1 here. Before we do that, let's copy this. I want to show that we just have the page and we just use object.prototype and see what the prototype object is assigned to on this page. We get a bunch of stuff back with different methods here and functions. Okay, so now that we use object.prototype, we see that the prototype object is inherited from our prototype specified in the URL, meaning that there is some manipulation going on. So we do see that we can manipulate the page. Prototype pollution is possible, but this is client-sided. So it wouldn't do any good to exploit this on a client side if we can't share a link with a user and show any kind of impact. So that's where our cross-site scripting comes in. So the next thing we need to do is actually look for a sink. So the easiest way to do that would be to go to sources, and we want to click on any of the, well, in this case, we're going to click on the document that we just loaded. So just the main page here. We want to look at some sources. So we'll say resources. We'll look at some JavaScript files, and we see that there are 2 JavaScript files. Okay, from here, what we're doing is we're looking for what we call a sink. So basically a Java method that allows us to do some kind of input. In this case, this is just if else statements, if parameter length, no input, if object prototype string call, object array, this doesn't do anything. So there's no actual input in the D param here. So now we look for the search logger and see if there's any input that would allow us to exploit. Method post, keep alive, nothing there. So this one is interesting, right? So let config, right? Let the config equal to, and we have a parameter, right? We have dparam new URL location. So some kind of URL, and it's converting that to a string, and then transport URL is false. But if you look here, the next line, we're seeing object.define property, and we're defining transport URL. So we see we're defining transport URL, and then it's saying configurable false and writable false. But what's interesting about this one is if I were to take this define property and I just pop that into Google, of course I need to do the CAPTCHA. Why wouldn't I? Verify, boom. We can click on the first one, doesn't matter. So we can click on the first one. We just want to see how the define property works. Okay, this is a good example. So object define property, you have your object, right? And then you have to specify your object. The next parameter you have is a value, and you specify the value, and then you have your like permission, right? Writable false. So this is what I want to look at. The define properties function in JavaScript usually has a value parameter that you have to set. But in this case, if we look at the define property, there's the config, there's the name right here. There's no value parameter here. And so it says configurable false, written false, but we don't have a value. So this leads me to believe, what if we can define our own value here? So in this case, instead of having proto test equals test1, we're going to see if we can use the value parameter and then have the value equal to test1. And so let's refresh. Okay. And so we see this stays the same, but if you look here under this document body, append child script. So this is giving us an issue, failed to load resource. So it's basically probably trying to load test1 as a source. And so we can further confirm that if we go back to the elements tab in DevTools, and we see here at the bottom, our test1 is a value. So we actually are, if we go to sources, we actually are adding our value about right here. And a value is actually being interpreted by the DOM in JavaScript. So we see that it's being interpreted inside script tags, which means that cross-site scripting might be possible. So in this case, the source is test1, which is not an external source. So we get 404. So if you look at, sorry, just one more time going back here, if we look at this error message, it shows not want to show anymore. Doesn't want to show anymore, but the error message was 404. That's what that was for some reason. Let's see if I can go off and click back. Yeah, let's go to console and see. Yeah, so here it is. Aborted 404 not found. So that was the error message because test1 is not in that valid website. So what we can probably do here is we'll do value is equal to, we want to do something in line. So instead of reaching out to a website, we want it to just look at whatever's inside the script tag as a source. And in JavaScript, you can do that with the data parameter. So you can do something like this, data, and then the data will be alert 1, something like that. In this case, should work. I might have to add some text, but we'll see. Okay, so that works. We can, XSS, put that in single quotes. We see XSS. So in this case, we have basically manipulated this property, right? This is a prototype property, transport URL. We assigned it a value of alert XSS. The reason why we didn't have to use script tags is because the page actually already has it in script tags. All we did is tell the source to look at whatever's after data instead of reaching out. So in this case, if this was a real attack, you would copy this, you would send it to, you would actually have your payload in these alert boxes here. You would send this to your victim, and then when they clicked on it, it would grab whatever your payload has to grab and do whatever your payload does. So this would be client-side prototype pollution chain with cross-site scripting. And that's how you would exploit that. Okay, I mentioned that there is an easier way to do this. There's a lot easier way with the Burp browser, and this is why I like using the Burp browser. Let's start over, and let's assume that we don't have any of this information anymore. If we just go to inspect and we go to something called DOM Invader, which is native to the Burp browser, we see something here, but it's, there's nothing going on. So what we can do is click on the extensions here, and in the extensions, you want to enable this burp sweep thing. So we'll enable this, we'll reload, but what we'll do is we'll click on this burp icon and it should show us DOM Invader. By default, this is usually like off, I think. So what we'll do is close this. What we'll do is we'll kind of set it how it was before, off. So what you want to do is you want to turn this on. Under attack types, you want to turn on prototype pollution. That's what you want to look for. Under miscellaneous, you don't necessarily need those things. Okay, and then here under main settings, you want to click the gear icon and you want to just see which syncs you want. In this case, all syncs are enabled. Sometimes you'll just see interesting. I like to use all because you never know what you'll find, especially when you're testing, you want to be thorough. Under sources, this is usually none, but I also want to use all because I want to test for that as well. We don't really care about messages. We can close that. Under attack types, see if there's anything that is interesting. So this I think is also configured off, scan for gadgets. you do want to scan for gadgets. Gadgets are what you'll be needing to look for in order to determine whether prototype pollution is possible. So this is something that I like to look for if you want to look for prototype pollution, and the browser will automatically look for that for you. All right, so you want to save that. And that's it. You can update the canary if you want, but you don't need to. This is just randomize things. You can also just re-randomize and update it. That doesn't matter. For this demo, we can just reload here. All right, so we reload the page. Let's open DevTools, go to DOM Invader. And as you can see, it scanned and we got one result. So in this case, it's saying it found a prototype pollution value. And if you look at the outer HTML, it's saying that it's in script tags. So it basically found what we did manually. What it did is it found that script that we saw here, the script tags where we put our value in, and it's just waiting for us to go. So in this case, it's saying you have options. You can just exploit this. And so what we want to do is click on exploit, we'll load, and boom, we get our cross-site scripting. And we can just copy this, we can send it to our victim, and the victim will click and get that cross-site there. So this is why I like using the Burp browser, because it's super simple. There's DOM Invader that will go out and look at those JavaScript files for a sync. So these are syncs, basically like, places where we can input that can allow us to exploit that client-side prototype pollution with cross-site scripting. And then it's a one-stop shop from there. Click one button and you can do your prototype pollution. Okay, that is client-side prototype pollution. I hope this was easy to understand. Let me know if there's any questions in the comments or anything, but let's look at how things look on a server-side perspective for prototype pollution, because that requires API manipulation and a little different approach than this client side. Let's take a look. Very similarly to the client side prototype pollution, where we did things in manual way and then we found a secret shortcut with Burp Suite, we're going to do the same thing with server side prototype pollution. I'm going to show you the manual way of how to test for just one instance of prototype pollution, and then we'll use Burp Suite to automate that and make it easy for you. I highly recommend you include these in your bug bounty tests and your web app security tests, as it can be valuable. So for this one, we're actually going to go back to opening our browser. Let's open that. Now that we're in our browser, we're just going to go to the labs here. Go to the labs. Who's this? Okay, so here we are in the lab. We're actually going to disable the DOM Invader. We actually don't need that right now. So the first thing we want to do is in our Burp tab, we see Burp history and we have a bunch of stuff going on here. So what we want to do is we want to set our scope and make sure that we're only looking at scope of our target, which is the lab. In this case, we only want the domain because we'll include subdomains in that automatically. So by checking off this box here, include subdomains, we're just going to close that. Here, what we want to do is go to this enable logging resources, and we want to just click on this here and go to show only in scope item. From here, by showing the in scope items, we only show the items of our lab. Okay, next what we want to do is start populating data into the history. This is going to help us to find our interactions with the APIs that exist. So we'll log out, my account, we'll log back in here, submit that again, it's fine. Okay, let's go to Burp and let's see what we got. So we can do things the manual way, just, look through the history of the things that we populated and look for request an API. In this case, it's not necessarily an API. This is right here. So we have one that's a change address. Have any more? I see. All right, so it looks like change address is the only one. Now, one thing to note is in history, if you look at an older change address, the session here might change. So if I went down to the latest one, the session changed. So we probably want to select the latest one if we're going to be tampered with this. And then send this to repeater. Let's send this request and make sure the session cookie is fine. Okay, so that's still fine. Admin is false. In this case, we have JSON spaces, which we can ignore for now. So one thing we want to look at querying with the API is we're looking for something called a gadget, which is a function that can, that we can utilize to do something. And although there's a bunch of things that we can probably change, these don't really help us except for the admin function here. So let's go ahead and try, we'll do this. We'll add a comma because we need to add another value. And this value we're going to have is admin. We'll see if it actually allows us to change that. Admin, cool. And then that's going to be to, let's send that. No, so it doesn't allow us to change that. So one thing we could probably do is see if this is admin is a prototype object, and then we can use proto to define that. So we'll say proto __ colon. We'll do it like that. And then this closing colon right there should be out. And is admin is true. And we'll send that. We still get a false. So usually if I'm manually checking for prototype pollution for is admin, I'd want to also go outside and see maybe if the admin is just not changeable and maybe there's another value that might be changeable, or maybe we can add another value. Before I do that, another thing we can probably try before we get to that is seeing if there is a constructor in JavaScript that this object is behind. And if the object is behind a constructor, then that might be something that we can change. So what I'll do is I'll just type in constructor. And if this doesn't work, we'll go to seeing if we can find another way to do that. So constructor, proto, and type. So when you specify constructor, you don't want to use the syntax for proto __ proto __ you want to change that to proto now. And now this is a constructor, it's admin true, and let's see if we can. Okay, so it did, in this case, the object was a constructor, so we're getting admin is true. So now if we go back to our browser and we refresh, we should be admin now, which we are. Now we can go to the admin panel, and we're Wiener right here, and the user we want to delete is Carlos. So let's go ahead and delete Carlos, and boom, deleted and solved. So that's one way we can solve for prototype pollution. I mentioned that there's a far easier way at times, so let's look at a way that we can do that with just using Burp Suite built-in functions here. Let me reopen Burp Suite. Okay, so I have a fresh Burp proxy instance right now. So let's reopen our browser. Again, we're going to load this lab here. New lab, new unsolved lab. Let's go back to Burp. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and set our scope once again. We want to add this to our scope, and we want to, there we go, include stuff. Okay, yep, that. And then we're going to enable logging, HTTP history, and we want to just show only and applying. Now, in this case, what we want to do, we still want to populate in the same way. So let's go ahead and click on home, my account. Let's do login, submit that account. We'll log out and we'll log in just to populate the logout login, simulate how this would look like in real life. Wiener. Okay, submit that one more time. Boom. So now we've done populated a few things. So what we want to do is we want to actually go to extensions, and we want a specific extension. So that's going to be in the B app store here. Let's click on that. We're going to filter by name, and we're going to look for something called server-side prototype pollution. So that's what we want. This, once you go here, you want to install that. So this is going to populate our sitemap with potential prototype pollution that it finds. So what we want to do now that that's installed is we want to go to HTTP history. Again, we want to look for that JSON, just keep looking for interactions with an API, specifically JSON. So we have one here, and this is what you're going to do. You right click and you want to do extensions, server-side prototype pollution, and you want to do a full scan. This menu will pop up. You actually don't need to check anything for this, and you want to click OK. Now you want to do that again for any other JSON, extensions, server-side pollution, and you want to do a full scan. Now you're going to let that scan for a bit, and notice the target lights up. That means that it has a notification. So if we click on target, do this drop down, we can see here under issues for this website, it says potential server-side prototype pollution via object flexion. So now that we have here, we can read its description. It's found the scan found response did not contain canary in the attack response, then followed up with a canary was found when the attack was nullified. The attack was done, there was no canary, but then when the attack was nullified, then the canary was there. And then basically it's just saying remediation, ensure keys such as proto, constructor, and prototype are correctly filtered. So it's either a proto object or a constructor object, which uses prototype when creating objects, or using the object create null API so that you can't create objects with the API. All right, so in this case, we want to look at the request as well. This is just a request. This is the first request. Burp, since another request was the same, we see response 1, and response 1 has canary tokens mentioned. This is request number 3. Request number 3 sent a proto object. Response number 3 returned those proto objects. So then the same thing, request 4, and then response 4 is admin false. So in this case, in the advisory, we can click explore issue, and when you click explore issue, you go to dashboard, that lights up your new notification, and it's generating the next. So let's see what it says. And this is part of Burp's new AI integration. It's pretty cool, actually. Test prototype pollution to modify is admin property. So it already knows, okay, let's try to modify. Burp AI is amazing. If you haven't used it yet, I recommend using it. Test deeper prototype pollution via constructor. That's what we did manually. So it knows that proto object wasn't working, and so it tried it with the constructor. And likely JSON spaces. So JSON spaces is another kind of attack to see if the constructor is vulnerable, whereas you write JSON spaces and then a number. And if it's vulnerable, if the API is interpreting that, it will show spaces in JSON in the response. For pollution, okay, now let's look for the 3 dots. Is admin true? Proto JSON spaces is admin true. That one didn't work. Let's look at this response. That one didn't work. Let's look at the is admin false. We can actually see this one. All right, there we go. Check for this constructor. Prototype is admin true, and in this case, it's showing admin is false. But what I can do is send this to repeater. because it's adding this proto here. So let's do this. Go back to target. I want to explore this again, and let's see if it can get it right this time. It's AI for you. So it actually almost got it right. What it did wrong here is it added a proto top level parameter here. Once you remove that, you should have this admin. But let's see if the AI can get it right. Okay, so it tested something else. Constructor prototype is admin true, and it did. It got it right this time. So AI is not perfect yet. Sometimes you may need to run it multiple times. I recommend trying it multiple times, but in this case, it got the syntax right. And if we go back to the browser, we can just refresh the page, and look at that. AI just exploited things for us. We can go to admin panel and we'll delete Carlos. And that's it. We solved that. So that's how you do it an easier way, using the integrated Burp AI. And as you can see, it's not perfect, but it does provide a lot of value. It makes things a lot easier. And even if it isn't perfect, you can see the request. You can see what it's trying to do, right? So you can see that it proto is admin true, and then you can see that it added a control there in this case. And then in the other ones here, you can see that, if you go to this one here, you can see that it uses JSON spaces, and it tried to do something like that. So I recommend doing it this way. Again, that extension is server-side prototype pollution. So you learn how to look for prototype pollution, how to attack prototype pollution based findings that you find, how to go about exploiting those vulnerabilities that you might find. But what about securing your web application from prototype pollution? Because what's the point of learning how to exploit prototype pollution if you don't know how to protect it? Well, there are a few ways. One being probably the most obvious is input sanitization. Don't allow users to just go and modify objects in your web application. When developing a web application, basic practice would be input sanitization across the board. There is another way to prevent prototype pollution, and that's using the object freeze method. So basically what you're doing is you're freezing your prototype objects when the application is deployed, so that if a user tries to change those objects, they're immutable, meaning that they cannot change. There are other ways, like creating a null object, so that when users try to create a prototype object, it just goes to null. And when merging prototype objects in JavaScript, use something called safe merge. There's other libraries out there. For example, Lodash has this function called merge, which is pretty much a safe merge. Utilize things like that, because in merge functions is where prototype pollution is usually found most commonly. There are plenty of other ways to secure prototype pollution. Just make sure you're safe with those web applications. Thank you for watching this video. Again, make sure you subscribe, comment, and like the video, and I will see you in the next one. Doc out.